199,000 jobs added in November. The unemployment rate came down to 3.7%.
You know, just this morning, you talked to Larry, we got 200,000 new jobs that beat all expectations. Heading into December, we saw 5.2% GDP growth, something that, Donald Trump could only dream about.
Stellar monthly jobs reports have been a recurring theme of the Biden administration, and November 2023 was no exception. 200,000 jobs were added to the U.S. economy, and the unemployment rate dropped to 3.7%, and both of these metrics exceeded expectations. But those are the facts. The feelings are radically different. Republicans have always enjoyed a polling advantage on economic issues compared to Democrats, and as we've discussed, that disparity recently hit a 30-year high. But how can that be when data, decades of data as a matter of fact, consistently show that the economy performs better when Democrats are in power? And what can and should President Biden do to correct the record? Well, before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, we have several clips to play. As is always the case, when President Biden and the Democrats get good economic news in terms of facts and figures, I love to turn to Fox because I love to see them, I love to see how they convey this data, whether or not they give Biden credit, whether or not they mention Biden at all, and to see sometimes them visibly struggle to cope with it and to try to find excuses for it. So we got a couple of clips here of Fox, and then we'll unpack it all together.
Expectations edging down to 3.7%. And U.S. employers added 199,000 new jobs to the economy, also up from 180,000 that economists were expecting. Here with reaction is host of Varney and Company, An American Built on Fox Business, Stuart Varney. Hey, Stuart.
Good morning.
What do you think about these numbers?
It's a resilient labor market. And President Biden is going to talk about this at some point today because these are good numbers for bidenomics. 199,000 jobs added to the economy. That's a bit more than expected. There's resilience there. The unemployment rate down to 3.7%. You'll tout that big time because he'll say that's bidenomics at work. And that is historically a very low unemployment rate.
Because of Christmas? More people are working in shops?
Strangely enough, retail employment actually went down. Well,
Really?
It didn't go down. It just came in at 28,000 new retail jobs. Okay. That's very weak for this time of year. The other side of the coin is that you're probably looking at no rate cuts from the Federal Reserve in the early part of next year, because this shows strength in the labor market, strength in the economy. And when you see that, the Fed is not going to lower rates, not going to raise rates, and it's probably not going to lower rates in the immediate future. So steady as she goes. You've got a labor market that is resilient, which is surprising because you've had a whole year of interest rate increases by the Federal Reserve. You've still got 199,000 jobs added to the economy. So you've got resilience there. Biden will say, this is Bidenomics, this is looking good.
Now, that was nice. That was nice. Stuart Varney giving Biden a shout out repeatedly. Of course, it was also funny to hear his co-host try to cope. Well, maybe these good numbers. Is it because of Christmas? Is it because of like seasonal jobs? Maybe people are working part time who would otherwise be struggling. Maybe is that what it is, Stuart? Really, Stuart? And he's like, no, actually, retail jobs have actually decreased. So it's good to see, again, somebody on Fox News give very abundant, well-deserved credit to the president. Then we have Maria Bartiromo. Now, Maria Bartiromo is also on Fox Business like Stuart Varney. She used to be a straight news journalist, but she's become a MAGA conspiracy theorist, constantly trying to signal boost all of the nonsense coming out of the House Republican Conference, like their impeachment efforts into the president. This is how she has reacted to the good jobs report.
Overall, you got to look at this report as a big positive. We've got more jobs created than expected. Joe LaVorne, you've been saying this for a long time, saying that the economy is a lot stronger than anybody understands. Your reaction?
It takes a while. Everything Steve said makes complete sense. The numbers are good numbers, no question. The fact that the unemployment rate fell is good. It was because household employment was up over 700,000.
Again, no mention of Biden. You can, if you look very closely at the panelists, they're all very unhappy. None of them are smiling whatsoever. You can tell it's just like, damn, not another good jobs report under a president that we don't like. And before we go on to the next part, I just want to again recap, because I mentioned at the beginning, The economy does perform better, generally speaking, on virtually every important metric when Democrats are in power. And in some metrics, that's been the case for 60, 70 years. Other metrics, it's consistently been the case for like 35. Simon Rosenberg constantly talks about this on Twitter. He constantly updates this. I definitely recommend that you follow him if you don't yet and you have Twitter. So he points out that if you look at jobs, right, jobs is one of the most important macroeconomic metrics, certainly more important than stock performance, right? GDP is probably the only other macroeconomic indicator that's more important than jobs, because more people need jobs and more people have jobs than more people need and have stock. And he points out that if you look at since the end of the Cold War, 33.8 million jobs were created under 2 terms of Bill Clinton, 2 terms of Barack Obama. 14.1 million jobs have been created in just 34 months under President Biden. In contrast, you take the Republican presidencies since the end of the Cold War, 1.9 million jobs, 16 years of Bush Sr., 2 terms of Bush Jr., and then 1 term of Trump. And it's because recessions have followed these presidencies. Fun fact, out of the past 11 recessions, 10 of them began under Republican presidencies. Jimmy Carter was the lone exception. And then you look at other metrics. You look at elevated wage gains, new business starts, and prime age worker participation rates, because people complain. Republicans are like, they move the goalposts. They're like, okay, we can't look at unemployment. You have to look at labor force participation. And yes, in some metrics, overall labor force participation is down since the pandemic, but that's because people opted for early retirement in a lot of places. If you look at prime age labor force participation, it's higher under Biden than it ever was under Trump, and it's the highest it's been since George W. Bush, like 2001, 2002. Best time to find a job since the 1960s. Uninsured rate is the lowest ever recorded. All sorts of good economic news. And then, of course, that's just internally. You compare us to other advanced economies. You compare us to the G7. And the U.S. is outperforming all of them. We have recovered from the pandemic quicker and much more robustly than Canada, than France, than Germany, than Japan, the United Kingdom. We are doing exceptionally well under President Biden's leadership. But those are the facts. And as important as the facts are, you have to factor in the feelings. The feelings, as I've discussed, are at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, more important than the facts, because the feelings, perception is reality, and feelings are what drive people to the polls. And so I'm thinking of like this iconic moment on the Fox Propaganda Network. And Shannon Bream, I'll give her credit. She took Chris Wallace's place. She hosts the Sunday morning, Fox News Sunday. She's a very good interviewer. She puts the screws to both Republican guests and Democratic guests. And this is Jared Bernstein, who's one of President Biden's foremost economic advisors. And he's a very good surrogate, a very good defender of the objective facts and figures of Bidenomics. But she asked him a good question. Okay, you have the facts on your side, the figures for the most part, but what do you say to people like this? And she plays a very emotional clip of someone struggling, even in this economy, as many people are. So I want to play this clip, and again, we'll unpack it together.
For it to reach average Americans, who, by the way, are telling us through their consumer behavior that they're feeling pretty good about their own financial conditions.
Well, they don't when you ask them about polling, though. I want to play something from a woman who's gone viral this weekend. She is a mom. She's a nurse. And here's what she says about the reality of her situation as an everyday American.
I feel like my husband and I are doing everything right. We both have good jobs. I'm a nurse. I'm a registered nurse. I work full-time. He works full-time. Somebody has to do something to change this, because like, I make good money. He makes good money. We don't live above our means.
She says they're actually living less than paycheck to paycheck. I mean, about over 60% of Americans say that's how they're living. We've got this stat also, a new poll from the Wall Street Journal. Only 36% of voters think that the American dream will actually be a reality for them. What is your message to that woman?
It's very important to speak particularly to someone who's going through that kind of pain. And I think the message there is 2 things. One, we are working hard to deliver precisely what she's asking for. And we're seeing signs. We're seeing shoots of improvement in those areas. Real wages are now growing. And they've been growing not just for a week or 2, but for 4 or 5 or 6 months. We're seeing, yes, higher interest rates, but also people's disposable income has been rising. So their debt service payments, what they're paying to service their lending, is actually quite low. Now, if another thing, and the second thing I would tell to her, is if you actually ask somebody like that, and I think you should, because it's important to flesh this out, What do they think of the fact that we've capped insulin prices at $35 a month? What about giving Medicare the power to negotiate lower drug prices? What about tax incentives for manufacturing jobs? What about capping out-of-pocket prescription drug costs? All of those are in play. They are legislated, Shannon. They are in the field. And I don't think some of the folks that we're talking to here know enough about that. Those issues poll at 80+%.
And they
all of that was absolutely true. Now, first thing you note that he did not deny her situation. Jared Bernstein didn't say, she's full of crap. She doesn't know what she's talking about, whatever. You can tell, unless she is the world's greatest actress, she clearly, legitimately is struggling, and it's affecting her emotionally. And I want to be very clear. We're talking about statistical trends and macroeconomic trends. This is not all encompassing. They do not account for literally every single person in the 340 million people here in the United States. Even in an economy in which the macroeconomic indicators are healthy and trending in the right direction, and they're generally positive based on every normal observation, you still have people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people struggling in this economy, just as you did when Trump was in power. It wasn't like 340 million people were just like, yep, everything's solid. It happened under Obama too. It happened under Bush. It happened under Reagan, and all the way back to President Washington. This is something that's part of the deal. You have people in every economy struggling to one extent or another. And that means that there's still work to be done, because you want to minimize that number as much as possible. So he did acknowledge her pain. But then he also said something, which is that he does think that there are a lot of people who aren't aware of all the things that President Biden and the Democrats have done, like with respect to insulin prices and, empowering Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices and et cetera and so forth. All of that is true. As a matter of fact, as was pointed out in a recent Financial Times poll, Americans are adamant that U.S. economic circumstances are getting worse. They're wrong. Share of U.S. adults who hold each view by whether the view is correct. Red is incorrect. Blue is correct. So comparing today to 1 year ago, which has increased faster on average across the U.S., so they're not asking for your personal perception. What do you think has increased faster on average across the United States? 90% of people got this wrong. Prices have risen faster than wages. 90% of people answered that. 90% of respondents, rather. It's wrong. Do you think that the rate of inflation has gone up, down, or stayed about the same since this time last year? 73% of respondents said inflation has risen in the past year. That's wrong. In terms of net worth, do you think the median American household is wealthier today than before the pandemic? 67% of respondents said wealthier pre-pandemic. That's wrong. Do you think someone on a median income could afford a better lifestyle today or a year ago? Better lifestyle a year ago, 63%. That's wrong. Most even think things are worse today than 30 years ago. Do you think someone on a median income can afford a better lifestyle today than 30 years ago? Better lifestyle 30 years ago, 60%. Wrong. Okay. Again, this is where it gets awkward, because you have to simultaneously balance two things: people's legitimate, sincere feelings, which drive them to tears and anxiety and stress. That's not fake. With also the fact that much of this, has to fit in to these overall macroeconomic trends. Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, he wrote about this back in September, and he's been talking about it nonstop everywhere you can get him in front of a microphone. He wrote this op-ed in the New York Times called "I'm Okay, but Things Are Terrible." We're not going to read the whole thing, but he says, listen, if Biden loses re-election, a key factor will be the widespread perception that the economy is doing badly on his watch. Poll after poll shows Americans rating their economic conditions, or economic conditions in general, very bad, and giving Biden very low approval. The strange thing is that these bad ratings are persisting even as the economy, by any normal measure, has been doing extremely well. And so he points out, we never got the recession. We had a soft landing summer. Real wages, especially for non-supervisory workers, are significantly higher than before they were the pandemic. And he says, and to correct a widespread misconception, no, these figures don't exclude food and energy prices. The government does calculate measures of core inflation, including those prices, but those are only for analytical and policy purposes. So why are people so negative about an economy that by all standard measures is doing very well? He says, when I first began writing about the disconnect between public economic perceptions and what appeared to be economic reality, I got a lot of pushback, two different kinds. First, was the argument that there were real economic problems that justified public negativity. People really hate inflation, even if their incomes are keeping up. And a year ago, real wages were still somewhat depressed. But at this point, inflation is way down and real wages are way up. Second, there was the argument that, in effect, the customer is always right. If people feel that they're doing badly, you should figure out why, not lecture them that they should be feeling better. He says, this is the key part, but here's the funny thing. There's substantial evidence that people don't feel that they personally are doing badly. Both surveys and consumer behavior suggest, on the contrary, that while most Americans feel that they're doing okay, they believe the economy is doing badly, or the economy presumably means other people. And he breaks down the evidence, poll after poll after poll, and consumer performance, consumer confidence data. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a vibes-based economy. There are a lot of people, the vast majority of people out there think that they're doing okay in this economy, maybe even good, but they think that everybody else is struggling. So for me, and I was going to play some other clips, but I don't want to drag this out. For me, it's this. Facts don't speak for themselves. They don't. They never have. They never will. And I do think Democrats struggle with this. I think that's Democrats' first faulty assumption. Just duck your head down, do your job, do a good job. It will be reflected in the public consensus and you will be rewarded with re-election. That's just not how this electorate works. Propaganda is a real thing. Narratives are a real thing, both on the right and the left. And the right has a colossal advantage. Fox News, the most popular mainstream news network, is ideologically driven to attack Democrats. CNN, the New York Times, Reuters, Associated Press, all these other mainstream outlets will gladly throw Democrats under the bus if it means, hyping up sensationalism and negativity because it generates clicks. MSNBC is really the only closest analog in the mainstream media to Fox News, and they have a fraction of the audience. Mehdi Hasan, the most progressive mainstream journalist on MSNBC and in the mainstream media, he's complained about this for months, that the media does not cover and seems to be disincentivized to cover Biden's good economic news, whereas the right is ideologically driven to downplay it or to not talk about it or to lie about it. And that's just in the mainstream media. We haven't even talked about the alternate media, people like Ben Shapiro, Tim Pool, Steven Crowder, et cetera, and so forth. They are much more turnkey than the media apparatus on the left, both in the mainstream and in the alternate. Number two, I feel like a lot of Democrats believe that if they brag about their accomplishments, it will be seen as insensitive and tone deaf because there are still, like we saw in that clip, millions of people still struggling. I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And I don't think you should allow the potential risk of alienating somebody struggling, drive you away from not talking about the things that you've done. You have to be as sensitive as possible, sure, and to not be tone deaf, but you can't ignore all the good stuff that you did because then people who turned out to vote for you in the last election are going to be like, well, what the hell did I vote for you for? Why should I vote for you again? So to me, and maybe you disagree, it has to be these two things. We have to speak for the facts. We have to brag. We have to claim the good, positive news. We have to reclaim the narrative. We can't shy away from it. And then to people who are still struggling, we should say, listen, much of that is because of the Republican Party. For example, parents, who are struggling perhaps with child poverty. Well, the child tax credit under President Biden and the Democrats, which cut child poverty in half, it expired because of 50 Republicans in the Senate. That is the Republican Party's fault, objectively. And we have to point that out to people because people have lives and hobbies and friends and family and loved ones. They're not going to keep that piece of trivia, on their brain. They're going to be like, well, damn. I used to have more money to help my kids out. Now I don't. Who's the president? Joe Biden, Democrats. It must be their fault. We got to constantly remind people. And then to people who are still struggling, we can say there's still more work to be done. Here's what we did. Here's what we tried to do. If you vote for us again, or if you expand our majorities, this is what we will be more likely able to do in the future. And here's how it's good for you. That's my perception. You let me know what you think in the comments.